Well, my name is Lisa Hilquist. I'm here today along with Sri, representing work that we've done at Cisco around customer Mindshare. Sri and I work in the Global Insights and Analytics team within Cisco's growth marketing organization. Within Insights and Analytics and throughout Cisco's growth marketing organization, they are highly focused on customer behavior and interactions within the Cisco brand, with the Cisco brand and products, and what that means to our business as well as to marketing execution and investment. Two other team members, Monica and Ade, were also instrumental in this work. We applaud them and appreciate all their hard work. For those of you who do not know, Cisco is a networking and collaboration services company. Current brand effort centers around technology, of course, but also about what that technology means globally in terms of possibilities, not only for companies, but also individuals in daily life. So what is Mindshare? Mindshare describes the amount of customer awareness around a particular product or company. For example, how top of mind Cisco and Cisco products are in the minds of customers and industry influencers. Mindshare is typically expressed in digital conversations relative to a company's competitors and competitive products in technology market categories. So each company's share of those conversations is measured by external groups, vendors, relative to all companies in the technology category as a portion of those total conversations. Mindshare can be really hard to quantify due to the vastness of the digital landscape where conversations can, and of course, the ever-changing and evolving nature of that digital landscape. Today, there's new properties, Instagram, Facebook, everything. There's something new coming along all the time. And while there are many vendors listening to and gathering these conversations, each one adds to the list of social and other digital channels and properties as they crop up. The data is not as plentiful as you might think when we get down to what we need for this work. The data can also be inconsistent, a bit unpredictable in volume, and sometimes not specific enough categorically. Cisco, we are highly data-driven and in a very detailed manner. We usually strive for data down to the contact and the account level, which is not available for these external measures. So that's a bit of a challenge for us, especially when we talk about getting pervasive use throughout the organization. Some of the data that we measure is captured daily, some only monthly, some even reported only quarterly. But before we get deeper into what those measures are and why they represent the digital conversation, let's talk a bit about why measuring Mindshare is important. So why is Mindshare important for growth marketing at Cisco? Our teams are organized and focused on business growth. Mindshare is relevant to business growth is the crux of why Mindshare is so important to Cisco. There was a study of digital awareness share impact done by marketing history research from Kantar, Millward Brown a few years ago. The finding of that study was that brands that increase overall and digital shares of awareness also grew their market share. It's really important. If we can show an increase in the share of digital conversations, we should see an increase, be it over time, in our market share for that technology group. As such, we refer to these measures as leading indicators of future market share increase, decline for that matter. There are also ties to overall brand perception and awareness. Strong digital presence relative to the competition is a key element of brand awareness, perception increasing or decreasing. And customers' perception of a brand is fundamental to a representative of their decision-making process during their buying journeys. If we believe customers' online behavior through organic search, social media posts, reading of media publications online gives insight into their perception of a brand, we can learn how, what, and from whom that customer is. Brand familiarity and perception scores measure whether a person knows about a company and its products and whether that person would recommend that company. All of these things can and do lead to digital conversations. And why they're so important to us. Let's talk more specifically about what Mindshare landscape measures. What does it mean for Cisco? There are currently 3 industry standard share of conversation metrics. Metric looks at top of mindedness a little bit differently than the other. Share of voice is commonly used across all measures, but typically means share of voice of industry analysts and expert discussions and articles and podcasts and conversations about technology markets and technology providers. This group is called influencers for a very good reason. They can have a major impact on technology conversations, start them or further them through their communications within highly respected information channels like the Wall Street Journal or industry analyst firms like the Gartner Group or Forrester Research. Customers or buyers of technologies pick up pieces of these influencer conversations, and they might retweet them or share them in their personal or work social channels. The data for this measure is typically quite small because the quantity of industry analysts is small. It also includes a sentiment or a tone, which is positive, negative, or neutral of the conversation. We'll talk about that a little bit more at the end. Share of mentions refers to social channels. Share of mentions in a social realm. It relates to total mentions about a technology or product or individuals through their social media channels. This one is most commonly associated with mentioning, and you see it a lot in social listening platforms as well. All of these conversations happening right now as we're talking are logged and categorized. And while we think of social media as a massive portion of the digital landscape, social mentions about products and companies might only be 500 mentions a day in total. 500 mentions a day times 30 days, 1,500 mentions a month, 4,500 in a quarter. That's not a lot of data in the world of petabytes of big data, but important all the same. Share of search is less commonly looked at as a Mindshare metric, but it does truly express a company's top of mindedness when an individual is searching for a company or a product solution. Search engines. Branded keywords are removed in this metric, at least as Cisco looks at it, in favor of topically relevant, so collaboration or conferencing rather than Cisco WebEx or WebEx, to really understand share of relative to competition. Share of search factors in the ranking of search results against the keyword. Keywords determines total searches in a time period, total number of people searching for collaboration, divided into the total number of people searching on collaboration and choosing Cisco in the search ranking results. Search data is, of course, massive. We all know it is. The number of searches in a day by the number of people searching is huge. However, once we start to narrow that to searches relevant from a Mindshare perspective, the data is also drastically reduced as the other examples. In addition to branded keyword removal, I just talked about, other terms are removed as well. For example, we're not interested in people searching for the definition of collaboration, but we are interested in people searching for best collaboration products. Our vendor, the vendor that we use at Cisco, enables us to filter out all of those general terms as well as the company branded terms so that we can focus on the searches germane to technology products. Means that massive data set is far less massive. Slide sheet. So why combine all of these three metrics into one index? Each of these Mindshare landscape representations are really important to Cisco, and we have individuals within Cisco marketing teams who look at those metrics on a daily, hourly, even basis, acting on what that view is without looking at the total landscape. We wanted to create an aggregated index that would allow us to analyze what is happening with Cisco relevant conversations across these three metrics that represent that Mindshare landscape. And that would enable our marketing teams to proactively what to do next. One obvious reason to combine these is so that we can keep our finger on the pulse of those digital conversations. If we're losing conversation share, we lose relevance, which probably means loss of market share. We want to see that before the latter happens and communicate it holistically within marketing so we can do something about it. This index is also designed to let us know of those changes, positive or negative, as soon as possible so that our marketing teams can address it with visibility into what each group of the three metrics that covers the three metrics is doing. This index also ensures that each share of conversation focused team is hearing the same message at the same time, including those other measures they don't focus on. It means all three teams can act accordingly, either in a siloed or incongruous or even less effective manner. Shared responsibility for addressing those changes. Combining the three metrics required us to address the quantity of data differences and disparities while maintaining focus on the key purpose of understanding Cisco's share of digital conversations. With the help of Sri and team, we determined a way to weight each metric within the index based on business impact factors. Sri's going to get into those details about that. Before I turn it over to Sri, let's quickly get back to Cisco's objective and challenges in designing this aggregated Mindshare metric. We're tasked with creating a metric combining three externally tracked measures: voice, share of mentions, and share of search. This metric would be used in marketing's KPI scorecard as one of the market perception key performance indicators. The metric needs to solve the usability challenge of acting on multiple voice out measures, ease data and metrics overload, and eliminate potentially incongruous action based on people focusing on individual metric results. It needs to represent the relative impact of each of the individual measures in a holistic, actionable view, while enabling identification of hotspots needing attention and key wins to chest up a little bit once in a while. Measure requires statistical intelligence representative of Cisco's data-driven emphasis rather than marketing's gut feel, which is a key theme at Cisco. Everybody has an opinion. What do show whether that opinion should be followed, or do we take a different path? That leads us to the technical details behind the creation of this aggregated Mindshare index. My colleague Sri is going to take you through that part of the work.
Great, thank you, Lisa. So, something else that Lisa did not mention, but I did mention it in my last year's presentation as well, that, at least inside Cisco marketing, and I think that's true, this is true elsewhere as well, there is always a desire for simplicity and a desire for a white box solution as much as possible so that folks can really understand what we are trying to do. We have data from these three sources, and we are trying to build an index, and we're trying to get the right kind of weight. You can use some of the simpler measures, and as Lisa also mentioned, the amount of data that we have available is also quite limited. So that's where we turn to BayesiaLab, using some of the concepts of mutual information and more, to actually begin to get a handle for what sort of connection do we have between market share, which is what we are ultimately going after, and something so top of funnel, like the Mindshare, which is, which is really at the other end of the spectrum. So nevertheless, just to give you a little bit of an idea of the data itself. So this one is share of mentions, which I call as voting by talking. Yes, as I mentioned, it's all about social media mentions and so forth. And if you look at particular graphic here, it's showing the data between our fiscal year 18 all the way to fiscal year 20. You begin to see a slowly decreasing trend. That is, Cisco is not mentioned as often as it used to be, at least in the social circles, across all of the technology elements. And obviously, that's a cause for concern. That's it's not nearly an exciting company to talk about. It's not the same as talking about the latest release of a phone or some other piece of new technology. A lot of Cisco's work happens to be at the back end. It powers all the networking work as well as collaboration work. And but you can see the struggle here. You can see that, okay, slowly but gently and surely, the share of mentions is coming down. Now, if you take a look at the second one, share of search, which I call as voting by action. And this really matters. When people are searching for a certain kind of technology, where are they? What is really going on? Here you see enterprise networking, which is really Cisco's bread and butter, building routers and switches and those types of capabilities. It's nearly 100%. It runs at 98 to 99%. So folks may not be talking about Cisco when in a social group, in social media, because it's not so cool to talk about it. But when push comes to shove, when they are trying to buy the technology, it's absolutely in the game. So it's presenting a very different view into that Mindshare aspect when it comes to some of these technologies. An interesting call out is security. You see that yellow line slowly trending higher. Depending on how you measure the market share in security, security, as you might know, is a highly fragmented market. So many people, so many players in there, so many aspects to the notion of security. But Cisco, by some measures, has about the leading market share. That market share doesn't amount to more than 10%. So that's an indication of the highly fragmented market. And the reason it sort of plays naturally to Cisco's strength is because of the network. If your network is secure, a lot of other things are naturally secure. So you can see through this increase in the share of search how slowly and steadily Cisco has made progress in the security space. Some of the others, like Collab, is going down, and this one is not even taking into account the recent rise of Zoom, for example, in the collaboration space. And I'm sure as we get the newer data, some of that will begin to show larger decline. But this is all good stuff, right? You begin to see what is going on. Then you have the share of voice. So this is actually the industry analysts and the influencers, the people whom others pay attention to whom our customers pay attention to, when they write about different topics. How often is Cisco part of that conversation? So I call that as the establishment point of view, if you will. Again, enterprise networking, almost right up there at 60%. But in other areas, again, security showing up decently in the 40%. And then other areas, again, a slow downward trend, with a few uplift in the data center, etc. So begins to give you a general idea of how these three pieces of input, how they are performing, how is Cisco performing overall. And if we count that out by looking at the market share, so how has market share changed? You can begin to see enterprise networking, the top gray line, beginning to trend down just a bit, while collaboration was trending up, obviously, but we have to see the newer data in 2020 with with COVID-19 and Zoom and so forth, as to the extent of the impact on Cisco's market share there. And at the same time, if you look at some of the other areas they're not changing so much, but there are small changes. Now, obviously, if you're given this kind of data and it's sparse, right? It's coming at a early level, leads to the types of questions. Okay, I mean, if I look at simple correlation coefficients and so forth, those things are not really giving me as much meaningful information and building out some sort of an index. And yes, we will, of course, continue to collect data. We'll continue to build it out. And this is not something where it's not a situation where you want to simulate a lot of data, because then, you want to get a very realistic sense of exactly what is happening. A lot of marketing investment dollars are going to follow the direction that we are actually going to go in. So we said, okay, we're going to keep it simple. We have a sparse amount of data. So let's go into the world of mutual information and so forth. So the next couple of slides are just a bit of a detour. Most of you are familiar with the concepts, but that's the level of explanation we have to give when we are talking inside the company to make sure that folks really understand what is it that we are trying to do here. So what we began to do was, okay, so we want to bring share of voice, share of search, share of mentions together into this notion of a mind share. That's the index we are building. That then will be somewhat loosely related to the market share. Now, we know, of course, that mind share is at one end of the spectrum. A lot happens between a mind share translates into market share. So, we try to make sure that everybody gets those caveats and they understand that, hey, just because you have moved mind share doesn't mean your market share is going to move. But if your mind share does go down, that is cause for concern and cause for trouble. So you want to be in the mindshare business. You want to make sure that Cisco is showing up in all the areas where we have something to offer to our customers. And then, of course, if we do all the right things after that, make sure that our product works well, we do the right marketing, do the right sales, that will translate eventually into good market share. So again, looking closer to the data. So obviously, anytime you begin to talk about mutual information, anytime we are talking to any of our stakeholders inside Cisco, we start with the notion of information, because that's at the heart of where we are going with this. As the audience here knows, I mean, information in the world of information theory, it's pretty much you have this beautiful formula here, the negative log of probability of an event. And as you know, probability goes between 0 and 1. So that's going to always be a negative number. So information ends up being a positive number. And one of the beauties of the information theory world when this was developed was that information is all about knowing something new. So in other words, if the probability of something is a 1, the information content in that is actually 0. Because, hey, if it's already raining and you're telling me it's going to rain, well, I mean, you haven't added anything to my net body of knowledge. And on the other hand, if the probability of something is really low, that becomes very information laden. And here we are in the US talking a lot about elections and polling errors back in 2016. So as those who paid attention to that round of elections knows that the one party's candidate was supposed to win based on the polls, but then the other party's candidate won. That led to a lot of soul searching. Where did we go wrong? What was wrong with the data? Or was it the modeling that was wrong? So there's a lot of information that came with that. And it was a surprise event. And so you would say the number of bits of information that was carried in that sort of information was rather high. With that basics, right, with the basics of information, get to the concept of entropy, which again, as you know very well, that's, it's really the average amount of information. So, you can easily derive it from the information equation as you sum it up across, all the different outcomes. And so its formula works out to something like this, the P log P. And entropy is also known as the amount of uncertainty, right? So the average information or the amount of uncertainty. And that, if you take a simple example here, like the toss of a fair coin, and you try to get the entropy of that, so you will say, okay, it's, if it's a fair coin, so probability of heads is half. So it's half log half plus half log half, essentially all the negative signs cancel out. So that's about 1 bit of information there. And if you compare that to a biased coin, you can see that, oh, if heads is 0.75, it is 0.25, and you apply the same equation, you end up with 0.81 bits of information. So there is less average information, there is less uncertainty in the biased coin, because obviously if it's going to turn up heads 75% of the time, that's what's going to happen. In general, this is always true. Entropy is maximum when you have uniform distribution of the probability. You actually have nothing that's giving you any particular information that says, oh, things are going to lean one way or the other. So anyway, this is the setup for an entropy. As you know, entropy, the lowest is 0. It can go all the way to log of n, which is, n is the number of outcomes you have. Now, these are the concepts that we wanted to apply. And of course, very specifically, so go to the next slide here, we wanted to focus on a change in entropy, right? Which is all about the gain in information when you add more evidence, when you add more information. So the basic setup of an information gain is essentially the change of entropy here as you introduce net new evidence. Information gain is also known as mutual information. It's in at different contexts. They are spoken of, different terms are used, but they are essentially the same concept. And essentially it's showing a relationship between your two random variables. And if you see the formula that's being applied here in terms of joint and probability, joint and marginal distributions, obviously if X and Y were truly independent, then your joint distribution of PXY will simply be PX times PY, right? Which will then greater denominator cancels out, you end up with log of 1. Essentially, information gain is 0. In other words, there is no mutual information between X and Y if they are truly independent. So these were the concepts we were going for. We wanted to use information gain. And of course, that is BayesiaLab's home territory. And I was like, hey, we have this beautiful BayesiaLab tool. Why don't we simply use it? And Lisa was like, yeah, it's your problem, solve it. And so we're like, okay, fine. So the basic concept that we are going for here, when you apply this to Marketshare and share of voice, search, and mention, is essentially that, okay, what's the information gain that we are getting in Marketshare if you add the evidence of share of voice, which, as you know, is the establishment point of view. So which is nothing but the entropy of Marketshare minus the entropy that you are left with once you add share of voice. And the beauty of this is these are symmetrical concepts, right? So the information gain of Marketshare given SOV will be the same as the information gain in share of voice given Marketshare. And we want to do that for each of the cases. We want to see, okay, what is the information gain once you add a share of mentions? What's the information gain once you add a share of search? And again, why not correlation? Again, this group knows this very well, but again, internally, we have to talk these things because correlation is very well understood. For some reason, mutual information, even though it's been around forever, hasn't made it into the mainstream. It's not, talk to two people, they'll talk about correlation. It's become part of the English language. Mutual information hasn't. So we have to still take the time to explain why not correlation and point out all the different kinds of distributions where correlation may show a very low association between these types of variables and the power that mutual information brings, where it's looking at the probabilistic distributions and trying to find if there is any sort of related information between two variables. And only recently we began using it for continuous variables as well, using the maximal information coefficient for continuous variables and so forth. So as far as Cisco is concerned, even though I've been pushing this notion of mutual information for some time, we created an index, and as Stefan just mentioned, when I spoke about 4 years ago and we were creating the notion of customer engagement, it was based on the same sort of notions. But even then, folks will use the output, but the notion of mutual information is still something that takes a little explaining before our colleagues inside marketing buy into it and begin to rally around it. So anyway, we are continuing to do that good work. And in this particular case, we use BayesiaLab in its most basic form. We took the data that we had and applied it to simple DAG here and looked at the results that we were getting. Now, point to be made, the data that I showed you initially, it was at the technology level. We were looking at share of voice at the technology level for, like, let's say for data center, for collaboration, etc. We instead actually, in this case, because of the limited amount of data that we had, we said, let's go for the aggregated share of search. Let's go for the aggregated share of voice, etc. And so we actually did those numbers, said, okay, let's look at it at an overall technology level. Let's not go on a per technology basis. We will go there as data begins to increase. Otherwise, we don't get enough degrees of freedom if we have too many of these variables. So we said, okay, let's stick with the aggregated numbers. So we had share of search, share of mention, and share of voice. And what you begin to see is, okay, how much mutual information that you have. And as you know, these 0.21, 0.44, these are the bits, and then the percentages here are the normalized values. And so we literally took it at its face value. We said, okay, so there's about 0.7 bits of information between market share and share of voice, 0.44 of mutual information between share of search and market share, and 0.21 between the share of mentions. And this is where, we could have gone deeper. In fact, we did attempt to go deeper, trying to go into optimization, how can we increase it and so forth. But it became pretty clear that the amount of data that we had, we were running out of real estate. So those are things which we have left to the future. Plus, there is a second aspect. There is this notion of simplicity that we keep coming back to. And pretty much my director, he looked at this, he said, okay, stop right about here. That, okay, we have the weights, we have an approximate idea of the relative importance of these different variables, and let's create an index out of that. And that index we have started with something very simple, simply normalize those 3 bits out of basically a scale of 1 and weighted it as such. So share of voice giving us about 0.52 of a weight, and share of search giving about 0.32, and share of mentions about 0.16, which brings us to the notion of the Mindshare index. So let me, at this time, I will turn it back to Lisa because she's the one who's taking it and running with it. So with the next slide, over to you, Lisa.
Oh, thanks so much, Sri. Yeah, and thanks for taking the ball I lobbed when I said, yeah, you fix it. Solve it. So we take all these weights, as we call them, which is really important for us from a statistical perspective because every marketing person has an opinion about their individual measure. So the comms team thinks that share of voice should have 5,000% weight, and of course the share of search team thinks theirs is more important, so on and so forth. So it's really important to come up with something that has intelligence and data intelligence behind it. So we're applying this now, and we add it, we distribute the 3 measures based on these weights, and we come up with an index. And that index, or that number, goes into our KPI dashboard. So we're still in the early stages of launching this, but that's what we're going to do. And now, you can go to the next slide, I think. Yeah. So how do we implement this? We have challenges. Shri's outlined some, I've outlined some. That's all going to get bubbled up and dealt with in a training and education. and a launch program. We have to educate people about how to use it. And as Sri also mentioned, this desire for simplicity as well as a white box solution is really key, while we have lots of people who are constantly going to poke at it and ask for the details behind it. So all the work that Sri's team did with the rating is really important to move the conversation in the right direction into, all right, how do we use this? How do we make it real for Cisco? How do we fine tune it going forward? There will be along that fine tuning. So the first part is launching it, putting it into our executive KPI scorecard. Second part is what I alluded to in the parts that I was talking about, is how do we roll in the sentiment piece to this? It's a really important factor in two of the measures. There's no sentiment related to search, but there is sentiment related to share of mentions and share of voice. And that can have a critical piece, a critical impact on what the numbers mean. You can have a share of mentions number that increases dramatically, but if the overall sentiment is negative, that means marketing takes a very different action. So we need to roll that in and figure out, do we do the same approach of creating an index that's aggregated for just two sentiments, or do we roll those together in some other manner and put that alongside of this index that says, okay, yep, we're increasing or we're decreasing, and oh, by the way, the sentiment was pretty negative. And just to make it a little bit, put a little more color on it, in general, sentiment is neutral. Don't get a lot of sentiment signals. So there's even less data when it comes to the sentiment piece. So that's a big challenge that we have, and we need to do it fairly quickly. Then, of course, how do we benchmark this and baseline it? There's lots of distribution methods that we could use to expand the data set to look at change over time in the trending and come up with a baseline. At Cisco, it's very much about, how do I know if I'm doing good or not, and the impact of the actions that I have. So this baselining and benchmarking is really important, so that we can see immediately, here's the index, here's what it's telling us today, here's what the baseline is. We might even have targets around that baseline and what is a stretch on that baseline of where we want to get to fully impact Cisco's business. Then, as I mentioned, we want to talk about, we have to make this more pervasive for marketing. And part of that is the conversation shift that Sri talked about from correlation, which everyone always asks for, causality. They want us to be, if I put this in, if I put $1 in here and I do this activity, how much market share am I going to get? You get asked that all the time. These things that we're doing here help us level set that and help us get marketing to a level of understanding so they can infer that impact that they're having without asking for that specific, how much market share did I increase? So lots of education and training within the organization. And then, of course, we want to continue to analyze this concept of a Mindshare footprint. Maybe there's other measures that are going to show up out there that we want to include in this landscape. And we'll roll that in and probably have to deal with the same challenges of data. But it needs to be an always on, looking at it continually, monitoring, not only from a what is the measure saying today, but also what is that overall landscape of where our customers have conversations about Cisco that we can consider in our measures and how we go to market. Okay.
Right.
Last comments?
Yeah, we are done here. Open questions.
Thank you.